modern proponents of progressivism like to believe and continually claim that they are the true defenders of science and reason, usually using their positions on the issues of climate change and evolution as evidence of such. But the truth is that with the latest battles over gender identity, sexism, and the alleged pay gap, many progressives are drifting over to the positions of some discredited scientific theorists of the 18th through 20th centuries. Modern gender studies theorists are pushing a new form of Lamarckian inheritance, a form of evolution that preceded the theory of genetic selection first put forward by Austrian monk and botanist Gregor Mendel in 1865. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French naturalist and biologist, held that organisms could choose to adapt to the environment in which they existed. He believed in the following principles of evolution. If an organism changes during life in order to adapt to its environment, those changes are passed on to its offspring. Lamarck believed that elephant trunks grew as a result of short-trunked earlier generations, stretching them in order to reach water and tree branches. A religious believer in God being a non-intervening force of nature, Lamarck thought all evolution was preordained and was unfolding according to his will. There were two laws to Lamarck's theory of the adaptation of organisms. The first law said, in every animal which is not past the limit of its development, a more frequent and continuous use of any organ gradually strengthens, develops, and enlarges that organ, and gives it a power proportional to the length of time it has been so used, while the permanent disuse of any organ imperceptibly weakens and deteriorates it and progressively diminishes its functional capacity until it finally disappears. The second law says all the acquisitions or losses wrought by nature on individuals through the influence of the environment in which their race has long been placed, and hence through the influence of the predominant use or permanent disuse of any organ, all these are preserved by reproduction to the new individuals which arise, provided that the acquired modifications are common to both sexes, or at least to the individuals which produce the young. Fast forward to the 20th century, and most evolutionary biologists had through experiments determined that Lamarck's theories could not be reproduced, whereas Mendel had developed the alternate genetic inheritance model that served as the foundation of what many years later would be broadened with the discovery of DNA. One of the Russian scientists that was most active in this field was Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov, who, while studying plant immunity traits with British colleague William Bateson, helped establish genetics as an official field of research. In fact, it was Bateson who first coined genetics as the term for this field in 1905. Despite the advances made in genetics in the early 20th century, in the 1930s, Vavilov would run afoul of a neo-Lamarckian who had an inside track for the ideologically correct biology that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin would accept, one that was more consistent with the principles of socialism and cooperation between individuals, as opposed to competition that was proposed by a Mendelian naturalist named Charles Darwin.
Now, Vavilov, as I mentioned earlier, was very well known as a geneticist. Here's an example of Bateson visiting him later on when he was at the height of his career in the Soviet Union. He established this great center that where they kept and stored, like a museum, the diversity that he had collected, had quite a number of scientists working with him, had plenty of funding from the government. It was essentially an ideal situation. And then along comes Lysenko. He was born in 1898 and was fairly obscure, and one of the things that brought him to prominence was in 1927, a Soviet reporter in Pravda wrote an article about him that praised what he was doing, and I'll quote from that in the next slide. He then came up with a hypothesis of vernalization that was pretty much a Lamarckian type of hypothesis. It turned out that Vavilov, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Konstantinov, close enough, who was one of Vavilov's students. They went through a series, because at this time Lysenko was getting a fair amount of attention for his hypothesis. They conducted a series of really fine experiments done on a large scale with good statistical analysis, and it essentially disproved entirely what Lysenko was doing. And yet Lysenko gained Stalin's favor, was named president of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and received the Stalin Prize in 1944. Now, here is this article that helped bring him to prominence. And in fact, if it weren't for a coincidence of a number of events, Lysenko probably would have faded and never even been mentioned in the pages of history, but he ended up having a profound negative, not just negative, but tragic effect, as we'll see. Here's the quotation from the story. It's a wonderful quotation. Lysenko gives one the feeling of a toothache. God give him health. He has a dejected mien, stingy of words and insignificant of faces. All one remembers is his sullen look creeping along the earth, as if at very least he were ready to do someone in. But then a little later in the article, this is the same article, the reporter turns the table and says, the barefoot Professor Lysenko has now followers, pupils in experimental fields. He is visited in the winter by agronomic luminaries who stand before the green fields of the experiment station, gratefully shaking his hand. And what really brings Lysenko to power is that Stalin sees in Lysenko's ideas something that is truly Soviet, that contradicts the Western tradition of Mendelism. And he then promotes Lysenko. And this photograph here, I think, this is one of those cases where you hear of a picture telling 1,000 words. This one really doesn't. You see Lysenko down here giving his speech, and then look at Stalin up in the corner looking at him. In one of the speeches that, and this photograph, by the way, is from 1935. I don't know that it is the very speech that we're looking at here, but it certainly depicts what we see. During this speech, Lysenko said that Soviet geneticists, and he was targeting Vavilov in particular, are kulak wreckers and saboteurs who, instead of helping collective farmers, they do their destructive business both in the scientific world and out of it. And after that just stinging speech, Stalin arose. The way the account of it goes, that he stood up, and I think that's great in this photo. You see him standing there in power, and he says, "Bravo, Comrade Lysenko, bravo." It's clear that he has this tremendous support from the powerful dictator. Now, one of the key concepts that Lysenko put forth was the idea of vernalization. And what he claimed is that to understand what he was talking about, there are two types of wheat, what we call spring wheat, which farmers plant in the spring. It then grows up into the late summer and produces a crop. Or winter wheat, which they plant in the fall, and then it must undergo a process that we do call vernalization, where the growing plants have to be cold enough, be frozen enough, that it triggers them then in the spring to grow and produce a wheat crop. And the wheat crop comes much earlier, and for that reason, winter wheat can be grown often without irrigation, because it produces an earlier crop, having germinated in the fall. And what Lysenko contended is that by freezing, giving cold treatment to the seeds of winter wheat, that they could be vernalized and become spring wheat. And the experiments that Vavilov and his students did showed very conclusively that Lysenko was wrong, that the environment did not change the genetics and convert winter wheat into spring wheat. And yet Lysenko's response to it, which is given in the second paragraph on this slide, is Skonstantinov must give thought to the fact that when such erroneous data were swept away from the field of scientific activity, those who failed to understand the implications of such data and insisted on retaining them were also swept away, which in a way is almost a prophecy of what's about to come. And that is this, geneticists were among the most affected of the purge that Stalin made of intellectuals during the late 1930s. And the fact that Vavilov and his students are now contradicting Lysenko openly means that they are some of the primary targets, and he's in essence here warning them what is going to happen. Lysenko and then another a philosopher named Présent, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but got together and launched a campaign against Vavilov, which was supported by Stalin. And a number of the events are here, and I'm going to read some quotations that illustrate some of the points during this time. Lysenko becomes even more Lamarckian during this period. Here's a quote that illustrates, I think, very clearly what he is trying to promote as the doctrine of genetics of this time. Heredity is inherent not only in the chromosomes, but in every particle of the living body. And you need but change the type of metabolism in a living body to bring about a change in heredity. And then in 1937, he publicly names Vavilov as an enemy of the people. In 1937, Stalin cancels the International Congress of Genetics, which was organized by Vavilov, scheduled to be held in Moscow, and then he ramps up his purge of intellectuals who are sent to prison or executed, among them dozens of geneticists, and who refused to accept Lysenko.
Under the pretext of Mendel and Vavilov's genetic theories being too reactionary, Lysenko borrowed heavily from Lamarck and from Marxist theories on the cooperation between organisms that went far beyond what was empirically proven in nature, such as believing that wheat crops could be grown close together and without fertilizers or irrigation. The results were tragic in both the USSR, which suffered a forced famine in 1930s Ukraine while using his agricultural methods, and in Mao's China, which later adopts some of his ideas during the Great Leap Forward of the 1950s.
The World's Fair in Paris, 1937. The vision of the new German man is in the limelight. Across from the German pavilion, the Soviet building is erected. In the Soviet Union, the winds of revolution have shifted. The era of the pioneer is over. The scientific and artistic avant-garde have been forced to adapt to the ideals of the party. The idea of the new Soviet man has been reduced to a socialist archetype of the commitment to work and the spirit of progress. In the battle over heredity theories in the Soviet Union, developments in Germany become a weapon. Nazi racial policies are identified with Mendelism. Genetic research is forbidden as well. Biological science has a new figurehead, Trofim Lysenko. Crop failure and food shortages brought him to power. The country needed a miracle, and Lysenko promised quick results. His socialist biology is based on Lamarckism, the idea that acquired characteristics are inheritable.
По методу Lysenko из каждого такого глазка вырастают пышные клубни картофеля.
As early as 1927, geneticist Alexander Zerebrovsky had tried to stop the advance of Lamarckism. He had written an article in Pravda. The article describes Hermann Joseph Muller's discovery that X-rays cause genetic mutations. According to Zerebrovsky, this finding demonstrates the falsity of the Lamarckian theory. 6 years later, Muller arrives in the Soviet Union. Together with his Soviet colleagues, he hopes to raise Soviet genetics to a position of world renown. Obsessed by eugenic ideas, Muller refuses to accept the Soviet ban on eugenics. Muller decides to turn directly to Stalin. He writes a letter to the leader of the Soviet Union. What Muller offers Stalin is a biological plan for the creation of the new socialist man. Dear Comrade Stalin, writes Muller, as a scientist with confidence in the ultimate Bolshevik triumph throughout all possible spheres, I come to you with a matter of vital importance. The matter is none less than that of the conscious control of human biological evolution. That is, the control of the hereditary material lying at the basis of life itself. Muller condemns the Nazis' vicious doctrine of racial purity, insisting that true eugenics can only be a product of socialism, and promises Stalin that it will be possible within only a few generations to bestow the gift of genius upon practically every individual, to raise the masses to the level at which now stand our most gifted individuals. With artificial insemination, the reproductive material of the most transcendentally superior individuals, the 1 in 50 or 100,000, can be used. Many a mother of tomorrow will be proud to mingle her germplasm with that of a Lenin or a Darwin. Muller promises Stalin that this turning point in the long story of biological evolution shall bear eternal witness to the greatness of the October Revolution. Muller soon learns that Stalin has read his letter. The awakening is brutal. His dream of the future has apparently displeased Stalin. At an official conference in 1936, genetics, eugenics, and fascism are branded as one and the same. Arrests follow. The same day that Muller flees the Soviet Union, one of his confidants, Israel Ogol, is shot. Moscow, May 9th, 1945. The Second World War is over. In the Soviet Union, it is Stalin who dictates the laws of biology. Man shall not be discussed as a biological creature. Eugenics ideas would never be applied. Under Trofim Lysenko, socialist biology has been elevated to state dogma. Many dissenting biologists and geneticists face the firing squad or die in prison. Henrik Fresen, Vasily Slepkov, Israel Agol, Solomon Levitt, Nikolai Belayev, Georgy Meister, Nikolai Vavilov, Grigory Levitsky.
In postmodernism, we have a new stage of Lamarckian or Lysenkoist beliefs. The new Lamarckians believe that gender is a social construct, although for many years they argued that sex was directly tied to biological traits of the organism. What makes this belief even less credible than Lysenkoism is that in 1930s Soviet Russia and worldwide, Mendelian genetics was only a recently accepted model of generational inheritance and was adopted by Vavilov and others largely due to trial experimentation, but which still lacked much knowledge of cellular biology. However, in the period between 1951 and 1953, the British and American foursome of Francis Crick, Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Watson, and James Watson discovered the molecular structure of nucleic acids, known as the double helix and DNA. Franklin was left out of the Nobel Prize awarded to the other three in 1962, which in itself could show some sexist prejudice of the 1950s in the scientific community. The German-British duo of Theodore Boveri and Walter Sutton had already developed the chromosome theory of inheritance in 1902, and in 1923, American zoologist Theophilus Painter claimed through a microscope inspection to have discovered that there are 48 pairs of chromosomes. A discovery later revised on inspection to be only 46 during microscopic examinations of human cells by Indonesian-American geneticist Jo Hen Gio. Combining the chromosomal theories and the new discovery of DNA, it was determined that the 23rd chromosome pair determined human biological sex. Those humans that were born with two pairs of X chromosomes would become biologically female, and accordingly all of the physiological and anatomical traits of a female, whereas those that received an X chromosome and a Y chromosome would be biological males. This has been taught in biology classes from grade school through university education since the mid-1960s.
Come up with some kind of conclusion. First, some history and background. Gender is a term that was created as a way to differentiate between biological sex, whether or not you have an Italian salami or a hoo-ha, versus the psychological, social, cultural, and behavioral characteristics associated with being female or male. In recent years, many social scientists have begun to believe that gender identity is not a stable and fixed trait. They argue that it is socially constructed and can vary over time. Some have even argued that there are more than two genders and have created additional classifications by using terms such as cisgender, transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, agender, etc. Anyways, the two competing ideas about whether gender is a social construct come from the familiar nature versus nurture debate. In other words, is it our environment that makes us who we are, or our biology? Those who say gender is a social construct often argue the following. Number 1, there are differences in gender norms in different cultures. For example, there are subcultures in India that identify 3 genders, and in Chile, some believe that you must channel another gender to accomplish certain tasks. The list goes on. According to the academics Candace West and Don Zimmerman, gender is an emergent feature of social situations, both as an outcome of and a rationale for various social arrangements, and as a means of legitimating one of the most fundamental divisions of society. By the way, I looked up Candace West on RateMyProfessor.com and she only got 2.1 out of 5. Would you eat at a restaurant that got such a low Yelp score? I didn't think so. Old Don didn't do much better. Another argument on the nurture side of the debate is that language forms our reality. The words man and woman are simply words to describe certain phenomenon, but don't describe every option or experience of all people in our culture. Phrases like be a man or boys don't cry are used to pressure boys into conforming to traditional masculine gender roles, while run like a girl and other women-centered phrases pressures girls into behaving in a way that is considered traditionally feminine. Others say that gender is a feature of nature, not nurture. They say that being exposed to testosterone and estrogen will make the way we behave inherently different. For example, there are studies that show male babies and female babies behave differently given different stimulus. Male babies tend to stare longer at mechanical objects, while female babies tend to stare longer at faces, which may explain why women and men tend to find themselves in different career paths.
So while we can always accept that there are alternative views of gender, the fact is that the gender studies perspective on identities does not possess any evidence rooted in cellular biology or genetics to substantiate its claims. This is why this politically charged field of study is being compared, perhaps even charitably, given the revelation since the 1930s, with Trofim Lysenko's pseudoscientific approach that began primarily as a proposal to increase grain yields. In both cases, the societal results far surpassed the original intentions. Coincidentally, in 1953, Joseph Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and in the power struggle that resulted, Ukrainian communist Nikita Khrushchev rose to power and eventually began to ease some of Stalin's totalitarian restrictions, at least within the Communist Party and Soviet elite. Khrushchev, unlike Stalin, wanted the USSR to become a world power without ideological prejudice towards science, and by 1955 he had begun to phase out Lysenko's methods of agricultural science, although he remained in his position as director of the Institute of Genetics at the Academy of Sciences for several years afterward. In 1962, the Soviet physicists Ginzburg, Kapitsa, and Zeldovich put forward a denunciation of Lysenkoism, the first official attack in the USSR against him since it was outlawed in 1948. This would be the beginning of the end for the now aging biologist, as he was removed from the academy and eventually had all of his work defunded, forcing him into retirement, where he would die largely unheralded in 1977. The end of Lysenko's reign of scientific censorship came 22 years after Nikolai Vavilov, the true Soviet pioneer of evolutionary biology, had died of starvation while imprisoned in Saratov in Russia.